Consider this a bonus lecture because we're going to go on a bit of a tangent, but I think it's very important to understand and it's a very good example of what we've been talking about. So, taking a step back, we've seen that for many years, different browsers have only followed a small part of the specifications set by the W3C. And this meant that browsers had different rules. And some browsers followed certain HTML and CSS code and others didn't. So that's the first problem. The second problem is we've also got other standards like ECMAScript, and this affects JavaScript. And of course the problem again is twofold. One, certain browsers don't follow all of ECMAScript's recommendations, and two, ECMAScript gets updated, same as with the W3C specifications. So over time, new functions and new methods get created. So what does this mean? Well, this means older browsers don't understand the code of the new rules. Makes sense, right? And this is why we mentioned polyfills in the previous lecture. So what is a polyfill? Well, at its very core, it's very simple. A polyfill is just a piece of code that provides a fallback if certain features don't exist within that browser's engine. In JavaScript land, this will be in that browser's JavaScript engine. But it doesn't have to be JavaScript. And this is important. Many people think a polyfill is just for JavaScript, but you also get polyfills for HTML and CSS code, which we'll also get into a tiny bit more later. But we are going to focus on this JavaScript piece because this is what's interesting and this is what's more complicated when it comes to dev. Now, polyfills usually follow a pattern. And the pattern starts with a simple question. Does the feature exist within the browser? And if the answer is yes, well then we don't need a polyfill. We can just resort to the browser's engine to handle that certain HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. It gets more interesting, of course, if the feature doesn't exist within the browser. And this is where we have to use a polyfill. Keeping track of the ever-evolving HTML5 and CSS3 support in today's web browsers can be an overwhelming task, and it can be pretty daunting. Sure, we can all use awesome CSS animations to create some whiz-bang effects, but should we? And which browsers support that certain feature? And what do we do about older browsers that don't understand that code? And of course, this is where polyfills come into the picture. And the website, and this is just one of many, HTML5 Please, it's useful for finding polyfills that do a particular job. HTML5 Please offers a whole list of HTML5 elements and CSS3 rules with an overview of browser support and any polyfills for each element listed. And before we move on, I just want to say we did mention Babel as an example of a polyfill. Now Babel was more targeted at JavaScript. To remind you, ECMAScript version 6 was a major update of JavaScript that brought new features and lots of syntactical additions. But ES6 was later renamed to ES 2015, and this was just done to reflect the changes in the release cycle. So when would we use Babel? Well, if you want to support Internet Explorer, for example, or you'd like to use the latest ECMAScript features in a browser that doesn't support it yet, then we use Babel. Whew, I know we're going through a lot, but nothing is better than with an example. So why don't we build our own polyfill? Then that'll help you understand how these things work. And today, let's implement our own polyfill for the arrays for each method. This was introduced in JavaScript 1.6 or ECMAScript 5th edition. In reality, for each is a very well supported feature today. But I've chosen it more for the fact that it's fairly simple to reconstruct and I can walk you through building this polyfill step by step. But I should note at this point that this implementation is by no means going to be a fully fledged comprehensive one. It's just going to be a way for you to really solidify your understanding of what a polyfill is. So if you really wanted to get into the nitty-gritty of certain polyfills for certain functions, I recommend visiting Mozilla Documentation Network or MDN. I'll put a link at the end of this lecture. Okay, so we've just said we're going to be building our own for each polyfill. And do you remember what the first step was? What is the first question a polyfill has to ask in order for it to be implemented? That's right. Does the browser support that feature? So the first step is let's check to see whether the for each method is natively supported by our browser. Let's go have a look.